Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about transfer pricing. So what is transfer price? Transfer pricing is the internal transaction price at which two business units within the same company exchange a good or service. So let's say there's a company that has two divisions, and this company happens to be a furniture firm. Division 1 produces pieces of wood and then sells these wood pieces to Division 2 that assembles the wood into the final product and sells it to the market. So in this case, Division 1 is the selling unit and Division 2 is the buying unit. And an internal transaction is happening within the firm. Now, in this case, when Division 2 is buying from Division 1, the price they pay for the products is called the transfer price. So from the perspective of the company, the transfer price theoretically nets out. So let's say the transfer price is set at $100. Each time the selling unit sells a product to the buying unit, they recognize a revenue of $100. The selling unit's revenue is 100 because the buying unit is paying $100 for that product. And each time the buying unit buys from the selling unit, they recognize a cost of $100. So the buying unit cost is $100. So at the firm level, the net change in firm profit would always equal $0. However, the transfer price does determine where profits get reported within the company. A higher transfer price increases the profitability of the selling unit, but decreases the profitability of the buying unit. Why? Well, if the transfer price is high, the selling unit is making more money for each product that they sell. At the same time, if the transfer price is set high, the buying unit is incurring more costs every time they buy a product. So let's look at an example to see how this happens. Sip and Tip Co. has two distinct business units as a result of a recent acquisition, assembly and distribution. Both are profit centers. Assembly makes collapsible lawn chairs that fit in a bag and have built-in cup holders. The chair's manufacturing cost is $5, and the distribution sells the products to consumers for $12. So that's the market price. The profit for Sip and Tip as a whole is the $12 selling price minus the $5 manufacturing cost, or $7 in profit. Now, if the transfer price was set at $9, how would this $7 profit be split between assembly and distribution? So again, at the firm level, Sip and Tip makes $12, which is the selling price of the chair, every time they sell a chair, and the cost of producing that chair is still $5. Well, this probably includes the allocated overhead cost as well, so that the profit is $7. Now let's look at what profit assembly would recognize. So each time they sell a chair to distribution, they will recognize a revenue of $9, which is the transfer price. The cost of manufacturing the chair is still $5, so that assembly recognizes a profit of $4 every time they sell a chair. Now let's look at distribution. Distribution buys the chair from assembly and sells it to the marketplace. They sell each chair for $12, and each chair is bought from assembly at the transfer price of $9. So that distribution recognizes a profit of $3 every time they sell a chair. So with the transfer price set at $9, assembly takes home $4 of the profit, and distribution takes home $3 of the $7 profit. Now this leaves us with some questions. First of all, how was this $9 transfer price established? And are there any different ways to set transfer prices? What would happen if transfer prices were set by the HQ versus when the selling unit or the buying unit is the one setting the prices? Finally, how could this $9 transfer price be agreeable to both business units when distribution only makes $3 of the profit while assembly realizes $4 of the profit? Surely distribution wants to make more of the profit when they learn that assembly is making $4 of profit. So in the next slide, let's look at the general rule of setting transfer prices. So before we discuss what the general rule is, we have some things to remember. First, let's establish the objectives of the buyer and the seller. So the seller on the left-hand side wants to sell at a high price because that will increase their profit. So they will set a minimum price that they're willing to accept and would be happy if this transfer price is set above this minimum price. At the same time, the seller always has the option of selling to external partners or customers. Could sell to external customers. Could sell to external customers. Now let's talk about the buyer. Well, the buyer wants to minimize the price as much as possible because they want to pay less. Wants to minimize price. So they will set a maximum price that they're willing to pay and would be happier if the price is set below that maximum price. And just like the seller, the buyer can always go to the marketplace and buy the product from an external supplier. So could buy from external supplier. And so the transfer price would be set somewhere in between these two bars. So it'll be higher than or equal to the seller's minimum price and lower than or equal to the buyer's maximum willingness to pay. Next, we have to think about the capacity constraints of the seller when determining the optimal transfer price. So this is an important slide. So here we want to know what would be the minimum transfer price that a seller will be willing to accept. The general rule is that transfer price will be equal to the incremental cost of producing the product plus the opportunity cost of the seller, which is related to the capacity constraint of the seller. So let's first look at what it looks like when there are no capacity constraints. So in this case, the seller can produce up to 100 units and they don't have an external customer yet, and the buyer wants to buy 50 units. So they can produce the 50 units within their capacity limits. So in this case, the opportunity cost of the seller is 0 because they have no capacity constraints. So the transfer price will be set equal to the incremental cost. Again, this is the minimum transfer price that a seller will accept. And the incremental cost of producing a product is our old friend, variable cost per unit. Now let's look at a case where there are capacity constraints. So you can imagine the seller has a capacity of 100 units, and they're using up all that 100 units to supplying their products to an external buyer. In this case, the transfer price per unit is the incremental cost per unit, which is variable cost per unit, plus the opportunity cost. And what's the opportunity cost in this case? Well, if I were selling 100 units to an external buyer and I can't produce more, I'm at capacity. To sell to an internal buyer, I have to give up sales to my external customer. So the opportunity cost is the contribution margin per unit that I would have made by selling to an external buyer. And variable cost plus the contribution margin per unit would be equal to the selling price of the product within the market. So in the next video, we will use this general rule to examine whether a transaction will take place given the transfer price.